Welcome everyone back to class of Dr. Gafni. This is the second session of the book of Genesis through the line of ancient biblical interpretations. It's always a pleasure to be learning with Dr. Gafni. With that, no further delay, I hand over the mic to Dr. Gafni.
I'm happy to see you again. And I want to briefly review the type of stuff we spoke about last week. So last week, we started by presenting the wide range of ancient Jewish biblical interpretations, meaning Second Temple, roughly speaking, Second Temple literature. And we realized, and also slightly later, we realized that people are mostly familiar with the medieval texts or maybe Chazal, but there's actually many, many more sources that one can consult while studying, while addressing biblical interpretations. We tried to understand the various factors that shape or that distinguish one type of interpretation from the other. So we addressed all sorts of factors such as who's the author, or the audience, what type of genre are we speaking about, the historical context of each type of interpretation. And we tried to present as one of our goals, trying to see or to detect the nature of each interpretation in light of those factors. We also emphasized that all ancient interpretations had one thing in common. They were all traditional interpretations in the sense that they viewed the biblical text as divine and therefore as authentic, accurate, ethical, and so on. The first session, not today's session, the first session was dedicated to the most ancient form of interpretation in the Bible, essentially to the Bible itself. We were trying to explore different places where the Bible interprets itself. Today's class will be devoted to another whole corpus of literature, and we're going to talk about the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. And our goal will be to become familiar with this type of literature, just describe it, define it better, and then to demonstrate a few examples from ancient compositions that belong to this corpus. I'm sharing my screen now. Okay, let's see if that works. 1 second. Okay, so as I said, session number 2 devoted to the we spoke about intertextual interpretation in the last session, and today we will address the apocryphal books, or Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. The first part of our lecture will be a description, defining, learning a little bit about this type of literature, and the second part, demonstrating. So what are the questions we're going to try to address in the opening part of our session? We want to know about these books, Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. In Hebrew, they have one name, one general name, Sfarim Chitzonim, or external books. In English, we distinguish between Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha, as we'll explain later on. The questions that we need to address now are, A, what are those books? What are the apocryphal books? 2, when, where, by whom were they written? 3, in what language were these books originally written? 4, briefly, this is a topic for an entire session. I think I even had a similar session a few years ago in Drisha, so we're not going to go through the whole story, but the tales, the historical tales of the apocryphal books. We will talk about the reason why these books were excluded from the official biblical canon, how they became Sfarim Chitzonim, external books, and finally, we will talk about the Apocrypha's books as a form of commentary. That's the very end. So let's start with our description. So what are the apocryphal books? What is Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha? How do we define these books? Anybody wants to suggest? Any ideas?
They're the ones that fall out of the canon, ultimately.
Okay, so books that didn't make it to the canon, that's usually the answer I start with. But there's a problem with that definition, because if I take your words in a literal manner, it means every book that is not part of the Bible is part of the Apocrypha.
Okay.
You need to be a little bit more narrow, say something positive, not just negative. Books that didn't make it to the Bible, but what could we say positively about these books? Okay, so I'll try to help out. The Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha, for that purpose, are books that actually were part of the Bible in some ancient Jewish communities in ancient times, but eventually didn't make it to the final authoritative canon in the rabbinic classical Judaism, but nevertheless, they were at some point in their past part of some version of the Bible. So here, this is the way I wrote it in my description. The apocryphal books are Jewish writings that were considered part of the Hebrew Bible in different times and places or social circles. But over the years, the apocryphal books were rejected and were not included in the authoritative Jewish biblical canon known as the Masoretic text. So we can say something positive about these books, not just that they're not part of the Bible, but also that they were considered at some stage or at some phase part of the Bible. We're continuing. When, where, by whom were these books written? So if they were part of the Bible, so obviously they were written by whom? Alan?
Prophets.
But they're not all the books are in the Bible are written by prophets, but I would follow what you're saying. They're written by Jews as a start, because if they were part of the Bible, obviously they're written by Jews. When, where were the main, I mentioned that before, where were the main important Jewish concentrations of Jews in Second Temple period? What two countries?
Israel and Babylonia.
So Babylonia, not as much. Israel, yes, and one other concentration. There were Jews in Babylon, but not so many. Where else? Second Temple period, mainly in Egypt.
Okay.
In Egypt. So the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, all these books were composed by Jews, where in Eretz Israel and also in Egypt, where the two important concentrations of the Jewish community back then operated. So we're talking about books that were composed Second Temple period. If I want to be more accurate or more exact, I would say, here you have the next screen. I'll just try to do it by heart, so you'll tell me what you see on the screen. So as I said, the first thing I mentioned, these books were written by Jews in the two main centers of Egypt and Eretz Israel. They were composed mainly during, I would say, 2nd century BCE into the 1st century CE. So this is a little bit more narrowing down the timing of these books, the precise timing where these books were written. What about moving on, in what language were these books written? So the language issue is a bit complicated. If these books were part of the Bible, so obviously, or most naturally, they will be composed in the same language as the other parts of the Bible, which are in what two languages is our current Bible written in? What two languages are the languages that our Bible is composed in?
Hebrew and Aramaic.
Hebrew and Aramaic, right. So most of the apocryphal books were indeed written in Hebrew and Aramaic. That's the language in which they were composed from the very start. However, some of these books did not survive, or I would even say the majority of these books did not survive in the original language. They only survived in a form of translation. We do not have anymore the original compositions, because as we will see later on in the class, these books were forgotten or neglected by Jews, and they only remained in a form of translation. So despite the fact that they were initially composed in Hebrew and Aramaic, some of them did not exist in their original form. In addition to that, we would emphasize that there is a chance that some of these books were composed originally in Greek. A minority of these books, scholars suspect, might have written originally in Greek. Jews in Egypt spoke Greek more than Hebrew, and maybe some of these books were originally written not in Hebrew or Aramaic, but rather in Greek. As I said, they did not necessarily survive in the original language in which they were composed. In Hebrew, people do not distinguish between the different types of books. They just refer to them as sfarim chitzoniyim, external books, essentially books that did not make it into the biblical canon. But this is the way that these books are referred to in the Jewish tradition. Among scholars, usually people distinguish between two different categories, the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. What is the difference between these two categories? So in the presentation here, you see 3 circles. The inner circle is supposed to indicate the Masoretic text, meaning our current version of the Bible, which includes how many books? How many books do we have in our Bible? How many books exist in our version of the Bible altogether?
24.
24 books, exactly. However, as I said, In ancient times, there were different versions of the Bible. In some communities, they had larger versions. The middle circle is supposed to reflect what we call the books of the Apocrypha, or books that are not included in the Masoretic text in our current version of the Bible, but nevertheless were part of another canon as defined by the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek translation of one of those ancient canons that existed in Egypt, and that canon included more books than what we have today. So books that are not included in the Masoretic text, but that nevertheless were part of the Septuagint, are called Apocrypha. The remaining books, which were considered by some Jews as part of the Bible, but are not both in the Masoretic text or in the Septuagint, they are called pseudepigrapha. So we have two categories of books that didn't make it into the Bible. The ones that didn't make it to our Bible, but were included in the Greek translation of the Septuagint, they're called Apocrypha. The remaining books, Jewish books that did not make it neither to the Septuagint nor to the, and obviously not to the Masoretic text, they're called pseudepigrapha. On the side, you have a whole list of books. I'm speaking from my memory, so I hope I'm not saying anything wrong. You have two lists of books there. One is in Hebrew and the other side is in English. These are the names of the books of the Apocrypha, not books from the pseudepigrapha. All these books are the Apocrypha. Which names are you familiar with?
Ezra.
Ezra. But Ezra, you're not talking about the Ezra that we have in our version of Masoretic text. There are numerous additional compositions named Ezra that are part of the Apocrypha. They're part of the Septuagint. I'm sure you're familiar with the book of Maccabees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the book of Maccabees is part of the Apocrypha. It's in part of the Septuagint, but it's not part of our version of the Bible. I'm moving on to the next slide. What we will do now is talk very briefly on the history of the apocryphal text and how did they end up, what do we know about them, how did they make it, what was their role in Jewish history. In ancient times, we mentioned that there were different communities, and each community had a different numbers of books that formed part of the Bible. In ancient times, in the rabbinic period, the rabbis had to determine which books they consider as part of the Bible and which books they feel that needs to be left out. In rabbinic literature, we still have evidence for this decision-making process where books were chosen to become part of the Bible, and while others were determined to be left out. I have on the screen here one source that indicates that in rabbinic times, this process was still an ongoing process. What does the text say? We have a verse from Kohelet, which is interpreted by the rabbis. What does the verse say? In Kohelet, what do we have? What does the verse say? Who wants to read?
Alan?
מהמה בני היזהר לעשות ספרים הרבה אין קץ.
Okay, so this is a verse that is found at the very end of the Sefer Kohelet, and you have the English translation of the verse. In a literal sense, it just means you should not compose too many books. But what did the rabbis make of that? It appears in the Midrash, in Midrash Kohelet Rabbah. What did the rabbis say? Who's reading in the Midrash?
כל המכניס בתוך ביתו יותר מכ"ד ספרים, מהומה הוא מכניס בביתו.
So what's the English? Who wants to do the English?
Well, anyone who brings into their home more than 24 books brings a riot/tragedy into their home.
Okay, so this is the opening phase. In ancient times, these books were still known to the rabbis, but they decided that we only include 24 books in our authoritative version of the Bible, and other books were left out. If these books were left out, so how do we know of them today? Who kept those books?
Well, the church, mostly.
So the Christian church, as part of their Hebrew version of the Bible, not the New Testament, part of their Hebrew Bible, included more books than we have today. And that's how these books survived, despite the fact that the rabbis decided to leave them out. We move on, and if we are now shifting to the second millennium, we will see that in I would say the 11th through the 15th century, most rabbis were almost not familiar with these texts altogether. Since the rabbis decided to leave them out, they became unknown to most Jewish rabbinic authorities. For example, Rashi never mentions any of these books, but even other famous scholars, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam, they rarely ever address these books or quote anything from these books, probably because they were just not known to them. In some rare cases, the rabbis would say that one should not take seriously any book that is not part of the 24 books. But since they never quote from these books or mention them by name, it leaves the impression that they were probably not so familiar with these texts. I have one quote on the screen that you have here. What do you see on the screen? You can read it immediately in English. What does the text say?
The quote from the Rashbam.
Yeah.
אין דבר זה הדברי התנאים והאמוראים ואין לחוש לספרים לחיצונים. This is not to be found in the works of the Tanaim and the Amoraim, and no attention should be paid to the apocryphal works.
Right. So that was the situation during the beginning of the second millennium, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th century. These books became unknown to most Jewish scholars. We move on.
May I add on something
Yes.
here? Why is he making this comment? Number one, but the other comment is that the Bali, I think, quotes Ben, or maybe there was something, but it quotes Ben Sira a lot.
Right. So I did not get into all the nuances, but you're right. There's one book that is mentioned in rabbinic literature, and that is Ben Sira, but it's a very awkward example because Ben Sira is quoted, but also elsewhere it meant the Talmud itself says that one should not read that book. So that's the only exception of a book that is mentioned by name. And nevertheless, the Talmud also manages to criticize people who study or consult the text of that book. So that is the exception. But as you saw in the list, we're talking about numerous numbers of additional books, and none of them appear in rabbinic literature, and also in Yemei HaBenaim, in the Middle Ages. I'm not saying you will not find any mentioning of any of those books ever. We're talking about hundreds of rabbis over hundreds of years. But these are rare exceptions that leave a clear impression that they were certainly not known to most important scholars. For example, Rashi. If Rashi was familiar with these books and learned about them, he would mention it somehow, right? If Rashi knew the stories of the books of Maccabees, he would mention Yehuda Maccabi or Matityahu when he spoke about Chanukah, but he doesn't mention these people ever, clearly indicating that these are not known texts to him. Okay? We're continuing.
I ask one question. If Rashbam is mentioning them as a category, do we know any reason that we know which books he may have actually had, or did he have any of them, or he just had heard?
Right. So Rashbam is mentioning it in a case with regards to very weird traditions about Moshe Rabbeinu in Midian. They're actually not found in our Sfarim Chitzonim. They're found in later medieval texts. So the type of Sfarim Chitzonim that Rashbam might have had in mind are not clearly the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha that we have today, but he's clearly making the point that none of the books that are beyond our traditional text should be part of our study when we are Jewish studies, the Jewish curriculum. So we move on to the 16th and 17th centuries. In the 16th and 17th century, during the period of the Renaissance, Jews and Christians become a little bit more acquainted, or they form close relationships. And at that time, for the first time again, Jews learn that Christians have books as part of their Hebrew Bible that they didn't even know of. It appears in a bunch of 16th and 17th centuries texts where Jews tell that they met or were exposed through Christians to these apocryphal compositions, and there you can tell from their language that they're very hesitant about the status of these books. They would usually say, "Look, you should know that these books exist," and maybe not so much beyond that. In the source on the screen, you have one example of that. Who wants to read? You can read it straight in English. Who wants to read?
I will. It is proper for you to know that the Gentiles added other works in the collection of the Holy Scriptures, which are currently not in our possession, and I wish to present them so you become familiar with them.
Okay, so this is a nice example. You should know that the books exist, but they're of Jewish origin, but at the same time, he's not really encouraging people to study these books. In later times, we're making one more step. In later times, in the 18th and 19th century, with the rise of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, Jews were not just satisfied knowing about these books, but they actually decided that they should bring these books back home, back to the Jewish communities, because after all, who wrote these books?
Jews.
It was Jewish compositions. They were part of the Hebrew culture, of the Hebrew original tradition. How do they express that goal? They started translating these books back into what language? I want to show everybody that these are originally Hebrew books. So you remember, these books did not survive in the original language because only Christians read them, and they read them in languages that were familiar to them. So what did these Jewish maskilim, enlightened Jews do? They started translating these books back into Hebrew. And by doing that, they tried to emphasize or demonstrate to everybody that these are actually Jewish books that belong to that were at some point part of the Jewish tradition, even if they didn't make it to the Hebrew Bible. Here you see on your slide, you see two examples, two editions of Jewish scholars who are trying to translate the books of the Apocrypha into Hebrew. One is from 1830 and the other one is from 1833. Questions?
Are these rabbis making the translation?
Yeah, it's an interesting point you're raising. Yes, these were rabbis, and some of them even got approvals from big figures, big rabbinic figures of the time. No, they didn't feel that they were threatened by these books, and even some important rabbis added their haskamot, their approval to these editions. I'm not saying all rabbis would encourage people to study these texts before studying the Talmud, but at least some of them were not opposed for Jews to become familiar with these texts.
There's another question that in chat. This is a bit older, from Sherry Feynman, just noting that the terms apocryphal and pseudo are dirty and dismissive.
So
Yeah, but
So
I meant that there was a stigma attached to them right from the beginning, or at least as we're understanding them in English, as they've been termed in English.
Okay, so I didn't really address the meaning of these two terms. Apocrypha in Hebrew would be translated to Sfarim Gnuzim, books that were put aside, and pseudepigrapha are books that are falsely attributed to whatever authors. But we will talk about the content of these books, and then maybe we'll also address these titles. We just have to complete our tale. By the end of the 19th century, there were many, many Hebrew translations or attempts to reconstruct the original language of these books in Hebrew, but there is still one thing that that was left for our story, and that's what happens in the end of the 19th century, but mainly in the course of the 20th century, when I'm turning the slide. Tell me if I'm right. The discovery of the Gniza. What do you see in the picture here?
Is that the guy from JTS is on the left?
Right. So one of them is Solomon Schechter, who is associated with the discovery of the Gniza. He discovered the Gniza, or he was one of the important people who advertised the discovery of the Gniza. He was still in Cambridge in England back then. So he's one important figure in the story. In the Gniza in Cairo, meaning in the synagogue in Cairo, some of the original compositions were discovered. Essentially, Ben Sirah, the original book, not the translation, but the original book was discovered. So that was a big discovery that influenced the entire world, not just Jews. Everybody was excited that the original composition and not just the translation is now becoming more known. And the guy on the right is Eliezer Sukeni, who is the main figure in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the caves in Qumran, near the Dead Sea, additional compositions were discovered in the original form, not just Ben Sirah, but also other books. And both of these discoveries made the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha even more important, because now it was not just a speculated attempt to reconstruct the original text, we see that these books actually were part of the Hebrew culture, of the Hebrew tradition. The books were found in within Jewish in the Jewish context and in the original language.
Why were the apocryphal books excluded from the biblical canon?
Okay, so this we don't have so much time to discuss this question because we're really getting short in time. But the question of why did certain books make it into the Bible and others did not is always going to remain some sort of mystery. Do you see the answers on the screen?
Nope.
No. So
Nope.
tell me, what do you speculate? Why would some books make it to the Bible and some wouldn't? What could be the causes for some books to be left out?
Sectarian associations?
Okay, what else?
Maybe the rabbis putting together the canon may not have known of lots of these books.
But we see that the rabbis were familiar with these books. They say very clearly 24 books are put in and other books should be left out. So they do show some familiarity with these books.
So perhaps they thought, oh, well, this is nothing new. We've already got this said. I mean, they might have a prejudice that the divine word has already said it in 24 books. Who needs 25? I mean, look at Esther. Esther almost, didn't make the cut. Also, there's some sort of, somebody alluded to it just a few minutes ago, and I agreed. But I think there's also some sort of inherent prejudice. Whenever there's a book period and a closing, and then there's the external books, the Chitzonim, that the stuff that made it in was somehow more worthy, and the stuff that was either didn't make it in or was on the fence, that it had some objectionable stuff in it. So I think it's starting out with a prejudice in the first place. Okay,
so I hear what you're saying. I had to make the presentation before I met you, so I wrote 3 ideas that are often mentioned, but obviously there's a lot of room for other ideas as well. Okay, so what are the 3 things? So one option could be the timing. Perhaps some books were composed later than others, and maybe by the time some amazing compositions were put out, the canon was already sealed or closed, and that's why even if these books made it into some communities, but they, at least in the main version of the Bible, they're already supposed to be left out just because of the timing. Timing could be historically, but also geographically. Maybe they were composed by communities that were not in the center of things, and maybe people who were not even as familiar with these books. So that's one option, the timing. The other option is the origin. Perhaps the people who composed these books were associated with negative or opponents or rivals of the main important rabbis of the time. And even if their ideas were amazing and fascinating, the fact that the authors were considered problematic would mean that these books were left out. And so that's timing and origin. And finally, maybe in some of these books, the ideas, the content was problematic. In some of these books, we are able to point out to problematic ideas theologically or legally. But in most of these books, it's hard to detect or to point out to something very visible and very clear cut. But it might be part of the story. So timing, origin, and the ideas, the content of these books are part of the explanations that could be used in order to explain why these books were left out. Okay, so now we're reaching the second part of our lecture. So the question we want to address now is what is the importance? What is the significance? Why do we view the Apocrypha as a form of interpretation to the Bible? So first I need to explain. So far we emphasized that the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha were books that were considered part of the Bible in some place or at some point historically. But that's not why I'm referring to these books as interpretations to the Bible, because that would just mean that they were considered as part of the Bible. What we want to understand now is how could they be used as a form of interpretation of our version of the Bible? How can we use the Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha as a form of commentary, of interpretation to the books that did make it to our version of the Bible? The reasons why this is such an important and crucial source of interpretation is because these books form very interesting connections or relationships with the Bible. And here in the presentation, I listed at least 4 reasons that would make them important sources. The first reason
The apocryphal books were indeed excluded from our biblical canon, yet they still serve as valuable interpretive tools for it. Next,
Continue.
many
Yeah.
many of these books referred to and elaborate on various biblical passages in general and on sections of the Torah in particular.
Okay, we're continuing. So some of these books I want to address now. Why did these books, in what forms did these books can help out?
I just want to highlight, thank you, Ellen, for that comment on regarding timing. This is something of a quote circle. The timing cutoff relates to what they wanted to include. Which, I mean, yeah, it sometimes does feel like we're drawing the circle around drawing the point and then drawing the circle around it, but
Mhm.
then wait for Dr. Gafni to,
Not that kind of a circle, like a logical circle.
Mhm.
So in what ways is the Apocrypha also a form of interpretation? So I sketched in the presentation 4 reasons why this could be viewed as a form of interpretation. The first reason is because some of the books of the Apocrypha actually add or elaborate existing stories in the Bible. The best example for places where there are additions that are inserted within the existing books of the Bible is the story of the book of Esther.
Yeah.
In the Apocrypha, or if you want to refer to it in the Septuagint, we have additional passages that were supposed to be inserted into the story of Megillat Esther, into the story of Esther. This is one type of way or one form in which the Apocrypha could be viewed as an elaboration or form of interpretation, developing certain ideas in the stories of the Bible. So it's not just in independent texts. It's also a type of text that could shed light on the Masoretic version of the Bible. Another way, the Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha are forms of interpretations. Many of the books in the Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha are attributed to figures from our Bible. In some cases, we're talking about autobiographies or things that would resemble an autobiography. So a certain book in the Apocrypha might be attributed to a particular author or figure in the Bible, in our Bibles, whether it's one of the forefathers or other figures in the Bible. And if these books are attributed to the figure, so obviously they could also be understood as a form of interpretation or adding something, shedding light on the story of that figure. The third way in which the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha are viewed as a form of commentary is because many of these books are located within a biblical context. Some author might tell a story and place the story historically and geographically within the larger context of a biblical period. So even though it doesn't interpret any particular passage in the Bible, but nevertheless, it gives us some sense of the atmosphere or the way that the author wants us to picture that historical period or that the setting of the Bible. So that's the third setting. So we spoke about additional verses or additional chapters. We spoke about books that are attributed to biblical figures, books that are placed historically in the same time. And there are also books that run parallel to biblical texts. You might have a book that tells the story of a certain period in the Israeli history in the biblical time, and you will have a parallel text that tells the same events, describes the same event, but not similar to the Bible, but rather a parallel composition. All these types of compositions can be viewed as a form of interpretation to the Bible. So the Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha are not just texts that didn't make it to our Bible, but were considered part of the Bible. They're also can serve as a form of interpretation to our Bibles. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. What I wanted to do now, and we really have a little bit of time left, is to demonstrate some of these ideas. So I brought here a few examples. Maybe we'll start now and we'll do a little bit more next week because it's really a whole world that we can read into or explore. But I did want to bring a few examples. The examples I mentioned here are referring to the following stories. We have one example from the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So that's the previous Parashah from Sefer Parashat Bereshit. We have an example that involves the story of Abraham, the beginning of Abraham's life. And that's the end of Parashat Noach and the beginning of Parashat Lech Lecha. I brought an example from the story of Jacob and Esau later on in the book of Genesis, and even the story of Judah and Tamar, which is almost in the concluding section of Sefer Bereshit. So we have 4 examples. Okay, so that's the first example I saw for a second. That's the serpent example. I'm skipping this one. And now we're moving on to the second example. This example is the story of Abraham, right? What we're going to do now is as follows. We're going to read the biblical text in Hebrew or in English, the Masoretic text, and then we will explore a few apocryphal compositions and try to discuss what they add to the story of the Bible. You see it right now on your screen. You see the Hebrew text of the Bible, of the Parashah, end of Parashat Noach, beginning of Parashat Lech Lecha.
Yes.
Right?
Bereshit
So-
Yod Aleph.
Okay. Does anybody want to read it quickly in Hebrew, and then we'll do it quickly in English, just so you become familiar with the text? And you have to pay careful attention to every detail in the text because it will be crucial for our discussion later on. So first, the Hebrew.
Okay.
Who's fluent with the Hebrew?
Do it, it's okay. ואלה תולדות תרח, תרח הוליד את אברהם, ואת נחור, ואת הרן, והרן הוליד את לוט. Okay, next verse. וימד הרן על פני תרח אביו, בארץ מולדתו באור כסדים. ויקח תרח את אברהם בנו, ואת לוט בן הרן בן בנו, ואת שרי כלתו, אשת אברהם בנו, ויצאו איתם מאור כסדים ללכת ארצה כנען, ויבואו עד חרן, וישבו שם. ויהיו ימי תרח, and here it's obscured because your photo is sort of right over the text, so I can't read.
Okay.
חמש, it looks like חמש? 5 שנים ו200 שנה, וימד תרח בחרן. And then the next.
Okay, and then
Yeah.
the next pasuk, ויאמר השם אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדתך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך, right?
Yep.
Okay, let's do it briefly in English and pay attention to every detail. English.
These are the begettings of Terach. Terach begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran died in the living presence of Terach, his father, in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Terach took Avram his son, and Lot, son of Haran, his son's sons, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, wife of Avram, his son, and they set out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there, and the days of Terach were 5 years and 200 years. Then Terach died in Haran. God said to Avram, "Go you forth from your land, from your kindred, from your father's house, to the land that I will let you see."
Okay, so this is an example. We read the text, the original, the Masoretic text of Sefer Bereshit, and what we will do now is we'll make an experiment. We will read one of the apocryphal texts that is parallel, or that could be viewed as an elaboration to this text in Sefer Bereshit. The text we're going to be reading now is taken from the book of Jubilees. Okay, so we're going to read from the book of Jubilees. I'll say a word about this book, and then what I will try to ask you is which elements were added to the story in this apocryphal composition, and where could these motifs, why did they enter this story? Why did the author of this book decide to add these components to to the narrative in Sefer Bereshit? A word about the book of Jubilees. The book of Jubilees essentially runs parallel to the book of Genesis. The frame or the story of the book is Moshe ascends to Mount Sinai, and he receives from the angels, or perhaps he sees on some sort of heavenly tablets, everything that happened from creation up to the moment of the giving of the Torah, of the revelation at Mount Sinai. So as you can understand, this is going to be a composition that is, in a sense, parallel to the book of Genesis, to Sefer Bereshit, but it's not identical. And that's why we can view it as a form of interpretation. What we will do now is read the text, and you will tell me what are the striking additions that he's adding to the story of Sefer Bereshit, and then we can also explore why did he want to add those components. Why am I not reading it in Hebrew? because the original Hebrew didn't survive. Only very few fragments were discovered in Qumran, near the Dead Sea, in Hebrew, but most of the books did not survive in Hebrew. It was only kept by some Ethiopian church in Gez, in some ancient dialect, Ethiopian dialect. So the original Hebrew was gone. So there's no real advantage in reading it in Hebrew rather than reading it in English, because it would both be forms of translations. So let's see what we have in the book of Jubilees.
Okay. And it came to pass in the 6th week, in the 7th year thereof, that Avram said to Terach, his father, saying, Father, and he said, Behold, here I am, my son. And he said, What help and profit have we from those idols which thou dost worship, and before which thou dost bow thyself? For there is no spirit in them, for they are dumb forms and a misleading of the heart. Worship them not. Worship the God of heaven, who causes the rain and the dew to descend on the earth, and doeth everything upon the earth, and hath created everything by his word, and all life is from before his face. And his father said unto him, I also know it, my son, but what shall I do with a people who have made me to serve before them? And if I tell them the truth, they will slay me.
Okay, you're not done yet. One more slide.
Okay. And in the 60th year of the life of Avram, that is, in the 4th week, in the 4th year thereof, Avram arose by night and burned the house of the idols, and he burned all that was in the house, and no man knew it. And they arose in the night and sought to save their gods from the midst of the fire. And Haran hasted to save them, but the fire flamed over him, and he was burnt in the fire, and he died in Ur of the Chaldeans before Terach his father, and they buried him in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Terach went forth from Ur of the Chaldeans, he and his sons, to go into the land of Lebanon and into the land of Canaan, and he dwelt in the land of Haran.
Okay.
Is that the end?
So, yes. So what I wanted to ask you is, what are the main elements that are added in the story of in the book of Jubilees? And I know you're already thinking about Chazal, the rabbinic, the famous Agadah in Chazal, but you remember this text comes a few hundred years before Chazal. So historically, we need to keep things in perspective. So what are the main elements that were added to the story here?
Theology, fire.
What do you mean?
I mean, this
Okay.
is an explicit statement that Abraham is rejecting idolatry.
Okay, so I think the most visible thing, the most obvious thing is we have here a whole description of Abraham fighting the idols of his time and preaching to his people in his environment that she abandoned their idols, and it even ends up by burning the idols. This is the most visible thing that you see here in the text. What other elements appear in the text? What else does he say? Abraham burns the idols. Haran, his brother, is trying to save them, but he's burned. And then Abraham and his family leave Haran.
Okay, so
leave Ur and settle in Haran.
It's why they have to leave.
Okay, so now before we immediately step in, it's important that when you read these texts, you first detect the crucial differences, and then you always need to ask, why do you suppose these additions were added to the stories? And I think that we can come up with a bunch of answers. What could explain this deviation from the biblical narrative as found in Sefer Bereshit? Why did he want to add this whole thing about Abraham fighting the idols, for example?
Well, because there's no mention at all about it. In other words, we don't know why God gives a command and why he chose him. And that's been terror, it's been for everybody. It's been the question of why Abraham.
Okay, excellent. So you could say that this edition was based on some, it was meant to answer theological questions. Why on earth did God choose Abraham? His father Terach has 3 sons. And we see here that Abraham is being chosen by God. Essentially, what Sefer HaYovlim, what the book of Jubilees is doing, he's trying to tell us that, as a matter of fact, before God chose Abraham, what happened before?
Abraham chose God.
Abraham chose God. Abraham discovered God and was trying to fight competing gods at the time. And only then God approaches him and tells him to go to the land of Canaan. What else can we see?
Yeah.
But that could
Well-
be one type of explanation, but I'm not sure it's the only one. This would be a theological type of explanation. But I think there are also other more specific things in the text that this edition is trying to resolve. What other problems in the text this is perhaps trying to answer?
Well, I mean, in general, it's why did Terach leave Ur?
Excellent.
You know?
When we read the text in Bet Knesset, we usually separate between Parashat Noach and Parashat Lech Lecha. So you open up next Shabbos, we're going to read Vayomer Hashem el Avram Lech Lecha, and we think that God one day just approaches Abraham and tells him to go to the land of Canaan, and that's when the journey starts. But when you read the end of Parashat Noach, you realize that the journey actually started before, and it was not because of God's call to Abraham. It was rather Terach and his whole family's initiative, even way before God approaches Abraham.
And
Perhaps this story is meant to say then what? So explain me. So in what way is this the story of Jubilees solving that problem? So what does it say? What does it add?
Well, it has that Terach was actually had set off to go to Canaan, but he didn't get all the way there.
But I would say beyond, it means that something was going wrong in their hometown, Ukastim. Something was not pleasant, right? They didn't have such a great time with their neighbors. What might have happened? So the story is also helping us understand what might have emerged, what might have inspired the family to leave Ur even before God approaches Abraham. Very good. What other elements are discussed in the story?
Let me ask a question. Unless I'm mistaken, is there any previous statement in Breshit that people worshipped idols or multiple gods?
We have negative statements about the door of the generation of the flood, but as a matter of fact, we hear also as hu chalikro b'shem Hashem in the book in Parashat Bereshit. We actually hear people who started calling or using the name of God. We don't have clear evidence for people worshiping idols, but at least from the perspective of the book of Jubilees, that was an essential thing. If God approaches Abraham, it must mean that he has done something, and it's taken to the realm of theology. So we said so far two things: an attempt to explain why did God choose Abraham, an attempt to explain why did the family leave the city of Ur even before God approaches Abraham. What else?
Well, this is a minor point, but why was Ur called Ur?
Oh, excellent. So the
Because it's
name Ur
Aramaic
is also a
fire.
very crucial thing. What is the meaning of the word Ur? In some cases in the Bible, Ur means
Fire.
fire. So they had to add this component of fire into the story. Where is the fire found here? Abraham burns the idols of the people from Ur. That's another element that is added here. And finally, one more thing: the early death of
Haran died.
Haran. Right, Haran is Abraham's sibling, and usually the kids die after their parents and not before. If Haran died earlier than he should have, he must have done something wrong. And the story also manages to include this element in the story. When reading the Apocrypha here, the book of Jubilees, I think it's a fascinating thing because it helps you understand that what we will find later on in Chazal is not the earliest attempt to deal with these issues. The rabbis in the Midrash have their own way of trying to make sense of this story. And they also talk about Abraham fighting the idols. But over there, the different elements are explained in a very different way. The fire over there is referring to the fire where Abraham was thrown into by the king Nimrod. So the fire is used in a different manner. The role of Haran's death is also explained differently. But there is some common ideas that appear, and they appear for the first time in the book of Jubilees. To conclude, do we have, Kyla, 2 more minutes?
I can give about 2 more minutes if people are willing to stay
Okay,
for
so
a
I
little bit
wanted you to
extra.
see one more. We started a little late, so we can get 2 more minutes. I want you to see one more fascinating text that is also part of this world of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, but we're not going to talk, I'm not speaking about Jubilees, because I wanted to refer to another book called the Apocalypse of Abraham. This is another text that belongs to the same time frame, slightly later than the book of Jubilees, and it's a third attempt, third meaning not just the way Jubilees explains it, not the way the rabbis explain, but another way that people made sense of the story, another way to explain Abraham, to tell the story of Abraham fighting the idols, and also another way of explaining the element of of the fire. So let's read it here. And again, I'll have to rely on your reading skills. Who wants to do it? It's 2 slides. Yes.
I'll continue. The apocalypse of Abraham. I, however, having thought over my father's anger, went out. My father cried, saying, Abraham. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Take and collect the splinters of the wood out of which I made gods of pine wood before you came, and make ready for me the food of the midday meal. And it came.
Okay, so I'll just explain. The book is composed by Abraham. It's written in first person by Abraham. And Abraham is telling us that his father Terach, who was selling idols or preparing idols, is asking Abraham if he can use the leftover pieces of wood, the chips, in order to warm up his lunch. So what does Abraham say? Abraham says, I'm ready to help. And this is how the story develops.
And it came to pass when I collected the splinters of wood, I found under them a little god which had been lying among the brushwood on my left, and on his forehead was written, God Barisat. And I did not inform my father that I had found the wooden god Barisat under the chips. I placed Barisat before the kindled fire, saying threateningly to him, Pay careful attention, Barisat, that the fire do not die down until I come next.
Okay, so Abraham essentially is using one of the idols for what purpose?
To monitor the fire.
To monitor, or that's a nice way of presenting it, or basically he's using the god in order to warm his food. He's burning the idol. This is a wooden idol in order to warm his father's meal.
Is he are you saying
it's a sarcastic language for telling him, I'm going to use you as a form of in order to keep my father's meal warm until he comes back.
So you
We're
think
continuing the story.
He's burning Barisat? That's I
right.
I read it.
You'll see it later on. You'll see it in a second.
And on returning, I found Barisat fallen backwards and his feet surrounded by fire and horribly burned. I burst into a fit of laughter and I said to myself, I said, Truly, O Barisat, thou canst kindle the fire and cook food. And I brought the food to my father, and he did eat, and I gave him wine and milk, and he was gladdened and blessed his God Merumath. And I said to him, O Father Terach, bless not thy God Merumath, and praise him not, but rather praise thy God Barisat, because loving thee more, he hath cast himself into the fire to cook thy food. And he said to me, And where is he now? And I said, He is burnt to ashes in the violence of the fire and is reduced to dust. And he said, Great is the power of Barisat. I will make another today, and tomorrow he will prepare my food.
Okay, so I hope you hear the sense of humor in this tradition. And this is another ancient story, an elaboration of the story of Abraham and the idols. But the fire here is a different fire. It's not the fire that where Abraham burns the idols. It's not the fire in which Abraham is thrown into, but rather it's the fire that helps Abraham warm his father's meal. The story here is, in a sense, a take of some verses in the book of Isaiah, when the prophet Isaiah is trying to mock those people who worship idols. He tells how they cut trees, and half of the tree they use to warm up their food, and the other half they create gods. So this is a take on that idea as well. But I wanted to show you here, and this is just one tiny example, how rich and with so much potential you have in using these texts as an ancient form of interpretation. And keep in mind, these are the most ancient compositions that are a form of interpretation to the Bible. We don't have earlier texts that reflect or discuss the stories of the Bible from a different, and don't just repeat the text itself. So these are very, very ancient records, perhaps the most ancient forms of interpretation that are not part of the Bible itself, that were discussed in the previous session. There's so much more to do, and I have so many more examples. I always prepare a lot more than I manage to cover. Maybe next week we'll do a little bit more of this, or we'll move on to the next source or the next genre, because we have, I essentially, in order to complete this series, we would need at least 10 sessions. So I'm already cutting down and trying to choose which would be the most crucial type of sources. So either we'll do a little bit more of this, or we'll just have to move on and discuss other types of texts. But that will wait for next week. And next week, hopefully, I will be able to see you just as you are able to see me. Okay. So have a nice day or good evening wherever you are.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank
And
you.
one timing note, if you are tuning into this class from the United States, we will be or if you are not tuning into this class from the United States, we will be switching over to wintertime Motzei Shabbat. So please double check your timing. As always, we are at 12:30 p.m. Eastern US time. This may now be something different in your time zone. We don't want you to miss out. And with that, take care, everyone.
Okay.
Please check out our other Fall Zman offerings at drisha.org/classes, and see you all next week.